it's one of those great things about the dairy industry that it's a very close-knit community where everybody wants to see everybody be successful. And there's always people willing to help other people out, especially those beginning farmers trying to get into an operation.
Hello, and welcome back to the Dairy Podcast Show. My name is Barry Bradford from Michigan State University, and I have the great pleasure today of welcoming one of my colleagues to the show, John LaPorte. John is a farm business management educator at Michigan State University Extension. His main area of focus is guiding farmers on how better understanding of their farm businesses can lead to improved decision making, with a special emphasis on cost of production, financial analysis, and risk management. Before working in Extension, John worked in agronomy sales and was a farm loan officer with USDA. He uses these experiences to provide leadership and programmatic expertise in production economics-based education. He also coordinates a program called the Beginning Farmers Demand Series, which focuses on assisting new farm managers with business strategies. So John, with that, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Barry. This is quite a pleasure to be on this. I've heard good things about the program and looking forward to being part of it today.
Oh, the conversations have been a lot of fun for me, so I'm looking forward to this one. So let's start with, how did you get into this line of work? I mean, there's a lot of kindergartners out there who talk about growing up to be a farm business educator, but was that the case for you? Did you grow up in agriculture?
I did actually. The county I'm based in is Cass County, and that's actually where I grew up on our family farm, a small corn and soybean operation. So I've been part of agriculture from a very young age, and got involved with our farming operation. Was one of those typical farm kids that we had an FFA program there at Cassopolis, so I was part of that, and that spearheaded me into pursuing ag communications initially as a degree field, and then I worked my way into agribusiness before eventually going out into the workforce and being a loan officer at USDA Farm Service Agency, eventually in working in agronomy sales, and then here to MSU Extension.
Okay. One thing that amazes me about you and your colleagues that have to work, especially in Michigan, across many different commodities and have at least a rudimentary understanding of many different types of ag businesses. How did you first get exposed to how dairies work in that side of the ag world?
That actually, most of that really started out when I was working for USDA. The county that I actually trained in had a number of dairies, so we had a lot of customers that had loans out with a number of dairy farms. So I actually got to experience a lot of in-depth understanding of dairies right away once I got into the workforce, and learned a lot about different approaches to dairies. And actually, where I got a really good feel for the fact that no two farms are really the same. And that's really the case with dairies as well. You might all try to raise the same thing. I mean, milk's the main thing we look for out of a dairy operation, but how people approach getting the most out of those dairy cows, and whether it's raising their own feed, and just the differences in how operations really go about trying to be successful are really as different as night and day. And so I got a lot of good experience right off the bat getting out into the workforce. And I'd been a little bit familiar with some dairies because we've got some dairies where I grew up, but I was up in the central part of the state, and we've got a fair number of dairies up that way, and especially dairies of different sizes too. That was a big change for me. Was most of the dairies that I knew were maybe on the smaller scale. Well, get a lot more diversity in looking at different sizes and scopes of operations. So right off the bat, got a good education on the difference in dairy operations.
Well, we're glad you got sucked into it, because I know you've been really valuable for a lot of dairies around the state. So let's get into that then. So at least from my perspective, 2022 was a pretty enjoyable year for a lot of dairy producers, just given the milk prices. But unfortunately, 2023 looks to offer much tighter margins, more like what we're used to over the years. And part of that, obviously, is the dramatic run-up in input costs that we've seen in the last couple of years. Are there some general strategies you recommend to dairy producers for purchasing strategies to control input cost, or at least to minimize the risk of being exposed to run up in price?
Yeah, I'd say the number one thing is inherently we know what the inputs are that we're going to need.
Yep.
And I've really been advocating, especially this last year, for producers to kind of do some forward thinking, some forward planning, as we're getting into the year where, especially if we're raising our own feed on the farm, thinking about what those inputs we're going to need to actually raise those crops, and thinking about like the high amount of the input. So if you've got something that fertilizer is always a good one to pick on, you need large amounts of certain fertilizers. If you're raising your own corn silage, you're going to need a lot of nitrogen. And so thinking about some of those larger purchases and being strategic in how you go about acquiring that, maybe not buying it all at once, but buying at least a little bit to kind of gauge where the market is. Is the price where you're at at least maybe not a great price, but is it a reasonable price considering where the market's been at or where we think the market potentially could go? Because there's a lot of concern and volatility that we've experienced here the last couple of years. And so just kind of planning out some of those steps of buying. Um, a great example of that is we see this a lot in grain marketing, where we kind of set ourselves up for setting some price targets. We maybe make some decision deadlines where we're going to get to a certain point of the calendar and we say we want to make sure we're locking in some of these products. So you kind of have an idea of how much you want to maybe buy at a time, look what that price is, and decide, do we go ahead and maybe make that purchase now, or do we think maybe there's a little bit better buying opportunity? But the idea is to be very proactive in those steps and kind of planning out when you want to make those purchases, how much, maybe with some price targets. And it might be as simple as we've got a base price we're looking at. We're kind of hoping maybe it's going to come down, 10% or 5% from where it's at. So that's maybe going to be our first price target. And once we get to that decision deadline we set, is the price there? Is it lower than that? Is it close to that? And then kind of keep in mind when you're making those decisions, what's the supply situation looking like? We spend a lot of time on fertilizer the last couple of years. That's been the big one in the news.
Yep.
But the same thing's been true on a lot of other inputs too, especially if you're buying some of your feed. And we're not necessarily talking about buying um, forages, or maybe if you're buying some of that silage, but maybe it's some of those minerals that you've got to get. What's the supply situation like? Because we're still dealing with a supply chain that's recovering from the COVID pandemic, and we're not quite back to where we were beforehand. And so there's still some hiccups in some of that. You want to kind of pay attention to where those supply chain situations are. And if you've got a product that's really maybe more of a question mark, maybe that's the one you focus on making sure you secure that first and make sure you have that on the farm before you move on to some of the other products that you say, I've got plenty of supply of that out there, but this input I have over here is a much higher need, or at least we've got a supply concern. Let's secure that first, or at least make sure we've secured as much of it as we can before we get too focused on buying a lot of the other inputs we got to spend a lot of money on.
Those are really good insights, John. So one thing I observe when I go talk with producers on some of the larger operations, one of the, I guess, economies of scale is often there's somebody whose full-time job is marketing milk, or locking in some of these inputs and making those kind of business decisions. And on a smaller farm, you just really can't afford to have a full-time person doing that. And I don't know the answer to this. Are there businesses out there that are offering those services to smaller farms at a reasonable cost where you can get some help to get those things done?
There's starting to be some of that out there. Some of your larger input suppliers, and a lot of this is more on the grain side of things. So again, if we're thinking about raising our own feed, we can see some of that where um, there's companies that are offering to kind of help manage some of those decisions. They kind of help you design this base plan,
Yep.
and then they kind of watch things for you and communicate. It's not as widespread. There's only a handful of companies that I've seen that really offer this, and they're your larger companies like ADM are really looking at these strategies. What I find really works really well for especially the smaller farm that doesn't have somebody uh, as part of the operation doing that is just making sure to have some good communication with the retailers they work with.
Yeah,
And so regardless of what input you're buying, you know the retailers you're going to work with, and there's usually more than one that you're working with to kind of make sure you've got the supply of what you need, just to kind of have an idea what their prices are, what their supplies are. Make sure to talk to a couple of them, because you can get a really good sense in an area of what's available, or maybe the trend that they're seeing for pricing. Because one thing we have found, especially the last year, is that depending where you're at in the state, input costs can be widely different, and in availability of certain products can be widely different. And whether it's feed, whether it's fertilizer, or even chemistry, a lot of differences depending on just where people are at in the supply chain, and who they're sourcing their those products from themselves. Good communication is always a good place to start. And as a smaller operation, it's probably your number one tool in your toolkit, because if you're talking to those retailers, they're going to let you know, because they're going to want to sell you those products.
sure.
And so they want to make sure you've got good information to be able to lock in that sale with them. And just having a couple that you can kind of bounce some questions around and get a feel for where things are at, that helps when you don't have the opportunity to utilize a service where somebody's kind of tracking that all the time for you.
Yep, that's a great point. Thank you. So we're having this conversation kind of early spring, and this is the time of year where a lot of producers, are needing to buy a lot of input costs, seed, fertilizer, that sort of thing. And it's obviously less extreme in the dairy business than in a straight up row crop business, but there are times a year, as milk prices shift as well, where cash on hand can run short. And I know one of your key focuses is on how to manage short-term debt. So, given the unexpected expenses that farms have to be ready for, they understandably need to keep some cash reserves. So sometimes the only way to really pull that off is to acquire some operating loans, and obviously like interest payments. So especially now that interest rates are higher than we've seen in a decade plus, how do you advise producers about how to navigate these situations?
Well, one of the things that's really helpful to do is to kind of get an idea of how much working capital you've got to begin with, and then kind of look back to what your average operating income has been. So the revenue you generate on the farm. A good target, like an ideal target, is to have over 30% of your annual revenue, your typical revenue you bring in, sitting there in working capital. So that working capital is 30% of the revenue you're going to bring in. Now, for some farms, that's a really high
It's a
number.
lot
For
for
other operations, that's easy to meet.
yeah,
So even if you had, say, somewhere between 10 to 20% of working capital in kind of a reserve position to what you're going to bring in for revenue, that's a good place to start. And that's kind of maybe the target you want to work with in cases like we're in right now, where we've got high interest rates. And I just looked at interest rates today for USD and some of the loans, and what we're seeing now in the last couple months is they're kind of doing this up and down pattern. And so what you want to really look at is, how do we maximize and utilize the cash we already have on hand, especially coming off a year like 2022, where we've seen some very profitable situations for farms in this last year. We've got working capital maybe to utilize. We kind of set that target of at least 10. If we can get to 30% and kind of keep it there, that's great. But at least kind of keep 10 to 20% somewhere in that range in reserve, but utilize that working capital you've got to save yourself on the interest rate, but then have those operating loans to kind of fall back to, say, okay, I've used as much cash as I feel comfortable with. I want to keep some in reserve. Now I'm going to utilize those operating type loans, and that's going to keep those interest charges you're going to have for the year down, because you're not drawing as much out of those operating. But it's a good way to utilize both systems to figure out, I want to make sure we're utilizing and maximizing the cash we have, but then having that additional safety net of an operating loan to say, I don't want to dip into my own cash reserves now. Now I'm gonna go make some purchases with the operating. And then if you get into a situation where suddenly prices have jumped back up again on some of these inputs, that's where you can kind of look at and say, okay, I've got the operating to use for that. Um, especially if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of cash to work with at that point. Having an operating loan is more of a fallback, is a nice way to use that, being or in consideration of using it rather in your first choice. If you can keep it from being your first choice and your first source of financing, that's great. And that's kind of what I advocate for farms to look at is don't get too crazy using all your cash up, because you want to make sure you got something in reserve, but kind of make sure to utilize both, and that's going to save you costs overall.
Yeah, that's good. And I'll just bounce this off you, something I've thought about the last year or two. I'd say over the last 20 years, not 100%, but many of the dairy producers who had a very high risk tolerance and kind of put all their cards on the table to scale up have really won, right? But that came in like a historically low interest environment. And so I worry a little bit about younger people in the industry looking back and learning from those lessons, but maybe they're coming into a different time period where the cards come out different this time. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, for someone wanting to start out brand new, if they're looking to start their own dairy operation from scratch, dairies are probably, I would say, the most, if not one of the most capital intensive type farms we have, because you got to have the buildings, you've got to have the livestock, you have the equipment. And so you want to kind of think about doing this transitionally as best as you can, where you start off small to some extent with the idea of creating your path for growth. This is where business planning is really important, because you can kind of think about, where do I want to start out with, where do I want to get to, create that kind of guidance path for where you want to get to as you grow the farm. But it also is really important to think about, in some cases, what it is that you really are passionate about doing within the dairy operation, what things you want to focus on, because there are opportunities to actually utilize either retailers or neighboring farms that you can work with to maybe partner to do some things that you don't necessarily either want to do, or maybe you don't have the capital to invest in buying the assets you need to do it. There was a great segment on the virtual coffee break program that we actually talked with a producer that they focused a lot on certain aspects of the dairy that they really enjoyed, and they worked with some of their neighbors to kind of work on some of like the feed growing and some of those aspects, because it was easier for them to focus on purchasing the capital they needed for the dairy cows versus going out and buying all the equipment you need to go actually raise the silage or raise the forage. And so there are opportunities to do that. I advocate for people to kind of take those transitional steps and work with the other farms in your area, because farmers want to see other farmers be successful. And if you're in a community, especially where you've got other dairy farms, it's one of those great things about the dairy industry, that it's a very close knit community where everybody wants to see everybody be successful, and there's always people willing to help other people out, especially those beginning farmers trying to get into an operation. The other thing that I have found, and we always get questions on this, and we don't have a great system for connecting people, but there are dairy operations out there that are looking for the next generation to kind of take over the operation. They're looking for somebody to come on board and get to know the operation and eventually transition into being the new manager and actually buying that operation out. And so there are a lot of great opportunities there for people wanting to get started, that it might be an easier path than starting from scratch. And you also benefit from, you've got the guidance of the current manager there to kind of walk you through what they've learned, how they approach things. And it's a great way to learn about what things you want to do and don't want to do when you're in the driver's seat of managing that farm. So there's a lot of different opportunities out there. And I know it can be really a frustration, because there's these large dairy operations. How do we compete? But really, you find those opportunities to start out small or to work your way into an existing operation that can be just as successful as a lot of these larger operations that are so well established, and can maybe be a little bit intimidating to compare against. But I still advocate for beginning farmers. There's opportunities out there. Just got to be diligent to look for them and figure out what one's going to work best for them.
That's good advice. So yeah, and I think it can be intimidating to want to get into business, but we have seen examples of people who literally start with no capital, no ownership, and it's amazing some of the stories out there of how people have grown.
Oh, absolutely.
So that may be harder or it may not be as hard as somebody that is looking at coming back to a family dairy so maybe they at some point can inherit some ownership, but there's all the additional wrinkles of working with family and all those things. So, um, and I'm sure you've heard many stories like this. I hear lots of stories about, it's almost a joke, the 60-year-old farmer who, gets to make his first decision finally. His 85-year-old dad often has finally said, okay, time for you to take over. So that's not necessarily something that's great at drawing people back into family businesses. So I know you've worked with a lot of farms about how to think about transferring some day-to-day decision making or even strategic management decisions to the next generation. How do you walk people through planning that and thinking through that?
Well, one of the most important things, especially for if the farm really does want to have that next generation take over, it's really important to start getting them involved early, and from that aspect, not just the production side, but more of the business and the financial management side of the operation. And a lot of cases, we'll find where people often think that, well, you're on a farm, it's established, you're going to be taking over this as the next generation. You've got such a huge advantage over anybody else. And that's true on certain cases, but a lot of cases, like you just described, Barry, there's the disadvantage of, the person's not making the decision until they're a lot older. They're close to retirement age themselves in terms of the stories we hear about the 60-year-olds. And so what I advocate for people is you want to make sure that you don't create the disadvantage by making sure people are involved in more than just the production aspects. That's the easy thing for people to get involved in. That's the stuff people like to do. And so you want to try to emphasize having people that younger generation involved early in understanding why are the decisions being made, what goes into a lot of those behind the scenes business goals that are developed, some of the financial decisions, what are the factors that are kind of playing into the goals we have on the farm and how we're achieving it. Most times people can see on the production side, well, we're trying to increase the milk quality, we're trying to increase the components, the butter fat and those type of things, because we know we're going to get more money for those type of things, and we know we've got to have good nutrition on those dairy cows to be able to get that. Those are pretty easy to pick out, and most people on the farm, that younger generation tends to be really good at managing the herd and the production quality. But getting people involved and offering an opportunity for them to build some experience, and what I try to advocate is it's not just having them as part of the conversation, work into a way where they're actually taking on some responsibility. It's going to be guided responsibility because the existing management team, that older generation, ultimately wants to make sure things are going to be handled a certain way because it's still their operation. They've got to be responsible for that. But transitioning some of that responsibility to that next generation of having them go through the steps and thinking through the different factors and having the decision of, this is the recommendation, this is the way we ought to go, here's my reasons why this is probably the best way to go, really, I think works. And I've seen that happen on farms where you've got that next generation coming in. The conversations that happen is you suddenly have everybody talking about, well, this is going on and that's going on, and we probably should go this way. Well, what about this situation that comes up? And now suddenly you've got this dynamic conversation amongst this multiple generation management team that is really benefiting, because now you've got the older experience of that older generation, but you've also got the thoughts and ideas from the younger generation mixing together, and you've got this really nice conversation going on. And that's what you want to try to create for farms that are looking to transition, especially to get those younger people involved. It also helps where one of the running jokes I have with beginning farmers is I often will ask the question of, well, why does your farm do this or that? And the response I often get is, well, we've just always done it that way. You want to be able to explain, why have we always done it that way? Have we decided that that's the best way because we've looked at certain factors? Or is it just because that's the way that mom and dad or grandma and grandpa have always done things, so we've just gone along with it? And I think getting to the point where you get people involved in really taking some ownership and some responsibility in some of the decisions is going to help them to get a better understanding of what goes on besides just managing the herd and the milk output, but really looking at the whole farm operation and seeing, what am I getting into if I want to take this over, and what things do I need to work on and learn is a big factor there.
I think that's a really important insight there is, this is the way we've done things. And obviously you can't start every day and just decide from scratch, well, how should we feed calves today, right? You'll never get anything done.
Right.
There's a balance there, right? But it doesn't mean that for 30 years you never make changes, right? And that's where I think extension conferences and things like that are good at helping just prod you and, hey, we haven't really reconsidered this practice in a long time. Maybe that's something we should dig back into. That's an excellent point. And that's where, like you said, I think having multiple generations involved can help with some of that too. Some people to stir the pot and reconsider some things. So that's kind of the operational side, right? And I one thing, even in my own family, one thing that's easy to muddle is, how do we think about operational transitions versus ownership transitions? So how do you approach that conversation? Because that maybe comes at a different time, but often it's kind of commingled, right?
Yep. Well, it very often is very much commingled. And what I have had the experience of finding is that farms that there where the succession planning process goes really well, starts off really well. Those who have actually started working on the operational side of things, where they've gotten that younger generation involved in looking at the day-to-day decisions and looking at some of the business understandings, because they have that really good understanding of the farm as a whole. They have a lot better idea of understanding how we think about making those transitions to where the older generation can exit and kind of go into that retirement mode and actually transfer the assets eventually over to that younger generation. They have a better understanding of why things need to work a certain way, and how that we go about thinking about ideas of to facilitate that. There's a number of ways that we talk with farms about transferring assets, depending on their situation, depending on whether there's non-farming and farming areas involved, and different situations of how we kind of map that out. What oftentimes I find for succession planning meetings with farms is that if they haven't done the operational step, we almost have to go back to that, because we've got to make sure that that younger generation has the experience, but more importantly, the self-confidence to take over the operation. Because if they have the confidence and the older generation has confidence in them, that's kind of where we look at the difference in goal setting, because the older generation has certain goals they have in mind that they want to achieve as they go off into retirement. They want some financial security, number one. They want to make sure they're going to be okay when they kind of turn the reins over to the younger folks. And we want to make sure those younger operators, those new managers, have an opportunity to establish themselves as this is their operation. And I think it plays a lot into how involved are they, that younger generation, and those other aspects of the operation, or the holistic view of the operation. Makes it a lot easier to have conversations about what are individual goals, how do we balance some of those, because sometimes there's some of the goals we have when we're trying to make that transition, they can conflict, and so we've got to find that balancing act. And I think it helps with communication, because communication is so important, just to be able to understand where everybody's at, what everybody's trying to achieve, and getting people involved in some of the day-to-day operations and some of those big decisions that go on. You build that communication right away, and that's so important to going forward, because a lot of times a succession plan will fall completely apart because families don't talk to each other. And you want to maintain that family connection. And so building those opportunities for communication that everybody can feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and ideas really is the building block to be able to move forward. And it's something that you build naturally as you get that younger generation more involved in the operations, actual business and financial decisions on top of the production side of things they're already involved in.
One thing that stands out a little bit in the dairy space compared to many other ag commodities is 95% of dairies have at least a couple of outside advisors coming in on a regular basis, typically at least a nutritionist, at least a veterinarian. Um, that potentially provides an opportunity for an outside influence to help stimulate some of these conversations and help people think about the way they should be communicating and planning. Have you seen examples of people that have taken advantage of that nudge?
Yeah, in fact, there's been a couple times where it's been the nutritionist that has reached out to me
Yeah.
and mentioned that there's this family that's looking to try to make this transition, and they've been the one that's helped kind of get the ball rolling to kind of start talking through that plan, and they kind of get us all together talking, and then they kind of step back. They've got a good understanding and relationship with the farm, and they're there to offer their thoughts and ideas as we talk through, but they're the facilitators of bringing everybody together, and in some cases bringing other folks into the conversation to help from outside the operation even too. But that's always an interesting thing for me, that with dairies, I don't find that with grain farms. I don't find that with vegetable or fruit farms. I don't really have the agronomist reaching out to me. But with dairies, there's such a relationship between the nutritionist and the veterinarian to the dairy operation that I'm not surprised anymore when I get an email from an individual like that says, "Hey, I'm working with this farm. They're trying to figure out the succession plan." Very common, and it's very helpful in a lot of cases because they can provide a lot of good information about what the farm, their background is, what they're trying to achieve, maybe who some of the people involved in. So it helps to know a little bit more going into those conversations, and they're great to be able to bounce ideas off of because they've seen the farm in operation. And so I always value those other members of the management team, not just the nutritionists, but any of those members of the management team. It could be your lender. It could be if you're working with somebody on certain marketing aspects with the co-op that you're in, or regardless of what you're doing. Those type of people can be great to be part of the conversation because they understand some of the nuances that go into that specific farm, and I've always valued that. I find that to be extremely helpful in those conversations, and helps kind of get some of that communication going forward that we need right off the bat.
Excellent. Okay, John, many of our listeners really enjoy sort of the wrap up phase of every conversation. So we've got 3 questions we throw at everybody, and we get all kinds of answers. So it's always fun. So, first of all, do you have a favorite dairy related book or resource?
Actually, when it comes to dairy, I find myself there's a number. I look at a lot of different university resources, but one of the questions that I have had come up quite a bit is on the question of the cost of raising the heifers.
Sure.
And so we understand the dairy cow side of it, but there's this interest on being able to figure out what's the heifer raising side of it really cost. And so probably one of my favorite go-to resources, Iowa State's got a great website with some resources, but one of them is they did a study here just recently in 2019 where they've got actually some information on what some of those average costs look like, and we tried to develop a tool for that about the same time. And we've got a tool sitting out there that kind of help people figure out about the same thing. And so I usually compare the two of those to kind of see what our numbers were like compared to their numbers. And I think they're pretty close. But I usually look to some of those resources probably the most because I get that question a lot. A lot of my work with dairy farms will do financial analysis, trying to figure out how profitable was the farm, how do the management decisions made on the farm really kind of benefit the overall growth of the operation. And we try to get into where we look at things from a more of an enterprise scale where we're looking at the really fine-tuned cost of production, which a lot of times people on dairy farms, they think, well, the milk's paying for everything, so the dairy's covering everything. So you can look at it holistically that way. But there's an interest to kind of dive deeper into the numbers and say, what are the heifers cost separately from the dairy cows? And is there a way for us to improve our profitability by managing the heifers a certain way? And so I'm usually looking to that for a resource to kind of guide me when I have those conversations. And it's one I get fairly often these days.
Okay. I bet you've never had a conversation where the producer overestimated their heifer raising costs. Have you?
Never
They
happened at
always
all.
cost more than people. I'm sure I wouldn't be any different. Okay, so second, what is your favorite book or resource outside of ag?
So I kind of changed my favorite book depending on what I'm typically reading at the moment.
Sure.
And I actually I have a book on Hall of Fame coach John Wooden that has been the one I've been trying. I'm trying to get back to reading it here in between all my different extension activities, but um, his philosophy on coaching and in terms of just how to approach building your skill in something is really kind of a nice template that I like to use. His 8 rules of learning are things I look back to, and I love the fact that basically rule 5 through 8 is repetition, 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 repetition. And so and I try to use that when I'm working with people that we're trying to especially as we're talking to this younger generation, the beginning farmers that I work with, and we're thinking about learning some of these things. It's kind of a nice go-to that I've got. But I picked up this nice book. It's got some of his other little anecdotes in it, and just thoughts and um, things that he's quoted over the years. And it's a little bit different take than some of the other books that are out there on him. And I enjoy it because there's usually a little quote or something I pick up that's kind of the quote I run with for a while. And so I enjoy going back to that. That's the most recent one I'm on to. But yeah, my favorite book changes depending on what I'm reading at the time.
I'm the same way. Yeah. But I'm with you. John Wooden would be on my short list of the most, the leaders I would turn to right away. Okay, last but not least, in your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those who are less successful?
Honestly, I would say it's the attention to detail. And when I say that, it's not necessarily that. And this will sound very odd coming from a farm business management educator, but I don't necessarily mean just the details you keep track of in your record book. I always advocate to keep as detail in your farm records because you can go back and look at those details. You don't just list feed or as being feed. If you're trying to look at things like the dairy cows versus the heifers, you want to make a notation of, was this feed for the cows or was this for the heifers type thing. But I think it's the attention to detail on all aspects of the operation. I've had some wonderful conversations with the farms already this year about as we've kind of moved past 2022 and we're now into looking at how we're managing for 2023. It's the kind of inherent ability to look at the details and think about what are market trends right now, what are the things I have to do differently on the farm, or what are some of the concerns I have on the farm that I'm going to have to weigh through, and what are my options to mitigate those risks. It's because people are thinking about the little details and the nuances. They're not just throwing feed out in a bunker and the cows are eating it. They're thinking much beyond that. And there are folks out there that are wonderful producers, and they, whether you're talking dairies or crops, they do a great job of producing on the farm. But those that can look at the details and really look at how those details influence their decision making and how they're going to improve the production or how they improve their marketability of what they're producing, I think those are the ones that are successful, because even if they're not necessarily writing it down, they're thinking about it. And that's where some of these conversations have been so wonderful, is that we start talking about what the farm has gone through in the past year and what they're looking to do this year. They're discussing all these details that they have looked at. They're not necessarily writing it in a book somewhere that they're going to go back to, which a lot of them do that. But when you have a conversation and you're talking about, what are your concerns on the farm? What are the things you're looking to try to your farm goals for the year, specifically in this year? You can hear those details and kind of picture those details that people are looking at. And those are the successful farms. Those that are just looking at, they kind of get in the monotony of the doing the same things every day, day out, and they're not really thinking about it. You're kind of more in this routine. You miss a lot of things. And so I find that the farms that really pay attention to the details, really kind of look for all those nuances and ways that they can make even the slightest little change of improvement, how to be a little bit more efficient, how to make things a little bit more effective on the farm. It may not be a huge change, but the little changes all add up. And that's that attention to detail that I really see with farm managers that really sets apart the really successful operations from those that maybe are still doing really well, but are missing a lot of potential and opportunity to really get to where they want to be a lot faster and a lot better.
Well said, John. Thank you so much. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Dairy Podcast Show. I want to thank again John LaPorte from the Michigan State University Extension team for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Barry. This was a lot of fun.
And if you're new to the Dairy Podcast Show, don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes. We'll see you next time.